Imagine you're standing at the edge of a forest 70,000 years ago. The sun is going down. Your small band of humans hasn't eaten in 2 days. Everyone is tired. Everyone is scared. And someone in your group does something no one else would do. They walk away from the campfire, alone, into the dark. Not because they're reckless, not because they're broken, but because something in their brain won't let them sit still. Something keeps pulling them toward whatever is past the next ridge, past the next tree line, past the boundary everyone else agreed was too dangerous to cross. That person, in our world today, would probably be diagnosed with ADHD. They'd be told they can't focus. They'd be told they're impulsive. They'd be given medication to slow them down so they can sit in a chair for 8 hours a day and do the same task without interruption. But 70,000 years ago, that person wasn't broken. That person was the reason their entire group survived. And now, for the first time, modern science is starting to prove it. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, affects somewhere between 2 and 16% of children worldwide, depending on which diagnostic criteria you use. In the United States alone, roughly 11% of children carry the diagnosis. That's millions and millions of people just in one country, and the numbers have been climbing for decades. But here's the thing most people never stop to ask. If ADHD is a disorder, if it's genuinely a flaw in human wiring, why is it so incredibly common? Why hasn't evolution gotten rid of it? Natural selection is ruthless. It doesn't keep things around that don't work. Traits that reduce your chances of surviving and reproducing get weeded out over thousands of generations. That's the whole engine of evolution. The things that kill you disappear. The things that help you survive get passed down. ADHD has been getting passed down for a very, very long time. And that raises a question that's only now starting to get a real answer. What if ADHD isn't a malfunction at all? What if it's a survival strategy? One that worked brilliantly for most of human history and only started looking like a problem when the world we built stopped matching the brains we evolved. Let's start with the genetics, because that's where the story gets strange. There's a gene called DRD4. It codes for a receptor in your brain that responds to dopamine, one of the most important chemical messengers in the human nervous system. Dopamine is the molecule behind motivation, reward, pleasure, and attention. It's the chemical that makes you feel good when you eat, when you accomplish something, when you take a risk that pays off. Everyone has the DRD4 gene, but not everyone has the same version of it. There's a specific variant called the 7R allele, and it does something unusual. It makes the dopamine receptor less responsive. That means the brain has to work harder to get the same reward signal. People who carry the 7R allele tend to be more restless, more novelty-seeking, more impulsive, and more drawn to risk. They get bored faster. They need more stimulation. They crave new experiences. Sound familiar? The 7R allele has been directly linked to ADHD in multiple large-scale genetic studies. And here's where it gets fascinating. Researchers estimate that this variant appeared roughly 45 to 50,000 years ago. That's not random. That's almost exactly when modern humans began their great migration out of Africa, the largest, most dangerous, most consequential journey in the entire history of our species. And the gene associated with ADHD appears to have been positively selected for during that exact period. It didn't just stick around, evolution chose it. In 1999, a researcher named Chuan-Sheng Chen at the University of California, Irvine, published a study that would reshape how scientists think about ADHD. Chen and his colleagues compiled genetic data from over 2,300 individuals across 39 different populations around the world and compared DRD4 allele frequencies with those populations' migration histories. The results were striking. Populations that had migrated the farthest from Africa had the highest proportion of the long alleles of DRD4, the variants associated with novelty-seeking and ADHD traits. The correlation correlation between long-distance migration and these alleles was 0.85, which in genetic research is enormous. Populations that had stayed closer to their origins, that had remained more sedentary, had much lower frequencies of those same alleles. In 2011, researchers Luke Matthews and Paul Butler at Harvard and Boston University confirmed Chen's findings using even more rigorous statistical methods. After controlling for neutral genetic drift, the kind of random genetic changes that happen in any population over time, the correlation still held. The ADHD-associated variants of DRD4 were genuinely overrepresented in populations with longer histories of migration and nomadic lifestyles. Think about what that means. The humans who walked out of Africa and crossed continents, who braved deserts and ice and oceans and arrived in places no human had ever seen, those humans were disproportionately carrying the same genetic variants we now label as a disorder. But migration is only part of the story. The deeper question is what ADHD traits actually do in the wild, not in a classroom, not in an office, in the actual world that human beings evolved in for hundreds of thousands of years. And when you look at those traits through the lens of survival in an unpredictable, dangerous environment, something remarkable happens. Every symptom flips. Let's start with distractibility. In a modern classroom, distractibility is a problem. A child who can't focus on a worksheet for 45 minutes falls behind. An adult who keeps losing track of a meeting gets passed over for promotions. But rewind 10,000 years. You're a hunter-gatherer walking through tall grass. You're looking for edible roots, and out of the corner of your eye, you catch movement, a rustle, a shadow, something that doesn't belong. The person next to you, fully focused on digging, doesn't notice, but you do, because your attention doesn't stay locked on one thing. It scans, constantly, automatically. Your brain isn't failing to focus. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do. It's monitoring the entire environment at once, and the moment something changes, it snaps to the new stimulus instantly. Researchers call this broad attention monitoring. In predator-rich environments, it's not a deficit, it's a superpower. The ability to detect movement at the edge of your visual field, to hear a sound that doesn't belong, to notice a shift in the wind, that's the difference between living and dying when there's a cave lion in the grass. The person whose brain locks onto a single task for hours at a time is the one who gets ambushed. The person whose brain keeps scanning is the one who sees the threat coming. Now let's talk about impulsivity. In modern life, impulsivity gets you in trouble. You say the wrong thing in a meeting. You buy something you can't afford. You make decisions too fast without thinking them through. But in a survival environment, hesitation kills. A predator charges from behind a rock. You have about 1.5 seconds to react. The person who carefully weighs their options, who considers the pros and cons, who thinks before they act, that person is dead. The person who moves before they think, who reacts on instinct, who makes a split-second decision and commits to it completely, that person lives. Impulsivity in the ancient world wasn't a flaw. It was the fastest possible connection between perception and action. And in a world where milliseconds determine survival, it was one of the most valuable traits a human could have. Then there's hyperactivity, the constant restlessness, the need to move, the inability to sit still. In a world designed around desks and chairs, hyperactivity is a liability. But in the Paleolithic, humans walked an estimated 10 to 15 miles a day, every day, for their entire lives. They tracked animals across vast territories. They migrated with the seasons. They carried everything they owned on their backs. A body that craves movement, that feels wrong when it's still, that has an almost limitless supply of physical energy, that body is perfectly designed for the life humans actually lived for 99% of our history on this planet. And then there's the trait that surprises people the most: hyperfocus. Most people think of ADHD as the inability to concentrate, but anyone who actually has it knows that's not quite right. People with ADHD don't lack the ability to focus, they lack the ability to choose what they focus on. When something genuinely captures their interest, when the stakes are high enough, When the stimulation hits the right threshold, they don't just focus, they lock in with an intensity that most people can't match. Everything else in the world disappears. Time stops. The task becomes the only thing that exists. Now put that ability in the hands of a hunter tracking an animal across miles of open savanna. The animal changes direction. It doubles back. It uses terrain to hide. Most people would lose the trail, but a hunter in hyperfocus doesn't lose anything. They see the bent grass. They read the footprint. They track the animal for hours, sometimes days, with a singular concentration that would be impossible for someone whose attention is evenly distributed. That kind of focus doesn't fail. It's ruthless. It's relentless, and it feeds the entire group. In 2024, a team of researchers led by neuroscientist David Barak at the University of Pennsylvania published a study that put real data behind this evolutionary theory for the first time. They designed an online foraging experiment. Roughly 450 participants played a virtual berry picking game. They found a bush, they picked berries. As they kept picking, the bush yielded fewer and fewer berries. At any point, they could leave the current bush and travel to find a new one. The question was simple. Do you stay and keep picking from a depleting source, or do you move on and explore for something better? This is what researchers call the explore-exploit trade-off. It's one of the most fundamental decisions any foraging organism has to make, and it's been central to human survival for hundreds of thousands of years. The results were clear. Participants who screened positive for ADHD traits abandoned depleting patches significantly faster than those who didn't. They moved on sooner, they explored more, and critically, they collected more berries overall. The non-ADHD participants tended to overharvest. They stayed at a bush long after the returns had dropped, squeezing out the last few berries instead of searching for a full bush somewhere else. The ADHD participants made better foraging decisions, not because they were being reckless, but because their brains were wired to sense when the current situation was no longer worth it and to shift to something new before anyone else did. Barak himself put it simply, if these traits were truly negative, you would think that over evolutionary time, they would be selected against. The fact that they weren't tells you something important about what they used to do. But the most striking piece of evidence comes not from a lab or a simulation, but from a real population living in the real world, under conditions very similar to those our ancestors faced. The Arial are a group of pastoralists in northern Kenya. Some of them still live as nomads, herding camels, cattle, sheep, and goats across the Kaisut Desert. Others settled into farming communities about 3 decades ago. Both groups carry the DRD47R allele, the gene variant associated with ADHD. But here's what makes the Arial so important to this story. The gene does completely different things depending on which group you're in. Among the nomadic Arial, men carrying the 7R allele were better nourished than those without it. They had higher body mass indexes. They were healthier. The ADHD-associated gene was making them better at survival. Among the settled Arial, the exact opposite was true. Men carrying the 7R allele were less well-nourished, less healthy. The same gene, in the same population, in the same desert, producing opposite results based entirely on lifestyle. Dan Eisenberg, the anthropologist who led the study published in BMC Evolutionary Biology, explained that the DRD47R allele is linked to greater food cravings, novelty seeking, and ADHD symptoms. In a nomadic setting, where you need to move constantly, scan the environment for resources, make quick decisions about where to go next, those traits are assets. In a settled environment, where success depends on patience, routine, and sticking with a single strategy over long periods, those same traits become liabilities. The gene didn't change, the world did. And that's the core of what scientists call the mismatch theory. It's one of the most powerful ideas in evolutionary psychiatry, and it reframes everything we think we know about ADHD. The concept is straightforward. For the vast majority of human evolution, roughly 300,000 years of our species' existence, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We lived in small bands. We moved constantly. We hunted, foraged, explored, migrated, and survived in environments that were unpredictable, dangerous, and constantly changing. The traits that define ADHD, rapid attention shifting, high physical energy, impulsive action, novelty seeking, reward sensitivity, hyperfocus under pressure, those traits weren't just useful, they were essential. They were the traits that kept you alive when a predator appeared. That drove you to explore beyond the next hill. That made you the first to spot ripe fruit on a distant tree. That gave you the energy to walk 20 miles in a day and still have enough in you to build a fire and keep watch through the night. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, everything changed. Humans invented agriculture. We domesticated animals. We built permanent settlements. For the first time in our species' history, survival didn't depend on moving. It depended on staying. It depended on routine, on repetition, on patience. Plant the seed, wait. Water the field, wait. Harvest the crop, wait. Do it again next season. For a brain wired to move, explore, and react, this new world was a cage. And in evolutionary terms, 10,000 years is almost nothing. It's a blink. Human evolution moves slowly. Our brains haven't caught up. The brain you're carrying right now is structurally and chemically almost identical to the brain of a hunter-gatherer who lived 50,000 years ago. But the world you're living in bears almost no resemblance to the one that brain was designed for. A genomic study published in 2020 in the journal Scientific Reports examined ADHD-associated genetic variants across ancient and modern human DNA samples, including Neanderthal genomes. The researchers found that the frequency of these ADHD-linked variants has actually been decreasing over time, from the Paleolithic to the present day. That tells you two things. First, these variants were more common in ancient populations. Ancient humans had more of the genetic architecture associated with ADHD than we do today. Second, there has been some selective pressure against these variants in the post-agricultural world, but it hasn't been strong enough to eliminate them. They're still here in millions and millions of people. Because even in a world built around desks and schedules and meetings and standardized tests, these traits still provide advantages in certain contexts. Creativity, entrepreneurship, crisis response, innovation, the willingness to take a risk when everyone else is frozen with indecision. And that brings us to something scientists are just beginning to understand about the ADHD brain at the neurological level. Modern brain imaging research has revealed that people with ADHD don't actually have less dopamine than everyone else. The difference is in timing. Their brains struggle to correctly time dopamine release in the striatum, the part of the brain involved in reward processing. When a reward is immediate, right here, right now, the ADHD brain responds powerfully. But when a reward is delayed, weeks away, months away, like studying for a test or saving money for retirement, the brain has trouble generating enough motivation to act. In evolutionary terms, this makes perfect sense. For a hunter-gatherer, almost every reward was immediate. You find food, you eat it. You spot danger, you run. You discover a water source, you drink. There was no evolutionary pressure to be motivated by things that wouldn't pay off for months. The ADHD brain is optimized for a world where the rewards come fast, where the environment changes constantly, and where the ability to act now matters more than the ability to plan for later. There's something else about the ADHD brain that doesn't get talked about enough: divergent thinking. Multiple studies have shown that people with ADHD score higher on measures of divergent thinking, the ability to generate unusual ideas, to make connections between things that don't obviously belong together, to think outside existing frameworks. This is the cognitive engine behind creativity, invention, and problem-solving in novel situations. In a world where problems are standardized, and the correct answers are already known, convergent thinking, the kind that follows the rules and arrives at the expected answer, is more valuable. But in a world where every day brings a new problem, where the old solutions don't always work, where survival depends on coming up with something no one has tried before, divergent thinking isn't just useful, it's the most important cognitive ability you can have. Think about the first human who looked at a sharp rock and saw a tool. The first human who looked at fire and saw warmth instead of danger. The first human who looked at a river and thought about about what might be on the other side. Those weren't the humans who followed the rules and did what everyone else was doing. Those were the humans who couldn't sit still, who got bored with the familiar, who were always looking for something new. There's a broader pattern here that extends beyond ADHD, and it connects to something deep in human evolution. Every group of social animals benefits from cognitive diversity. A wolf pack doesn't need every wolf to behave the same way. It needs scouts and it needs sentinels. It needs wolves that explore and wolves that hold position. The same is true for humans. A band of hunter-gatherers doesn't need 25 identical brains. It needs a mix. Cautious planners who manage resources, bold explorers who find new ones, patient trackers who can follow a trail for hours, quick reactors who can respond to a threat in an instant. ADHD in this framework isn't a disorder, it's a cognitive specialization, a role within the group. The explorers, the scouts, the ones who ventured into the unknown and came back with information that kept everyone alive. Without them, the group stagnates. It stays in one place too long. It exhausts its resources. It fails to adapt when conditions change. The group needs both kinds of minds. And for most of human history, it had them. The problem started not when ADHD appeared, but when we built a world that no longer had a place for the role it was designed to fill. Consider the modern classroom. A child sits at a desk for 6 to 8 hours a day. They're expected to focus on a single task in silence for long stretches. They're penalized for moving, punished for talking out of turn, graded on their ability to sit still and follow instructions. For a child whose brain is wired to scan the environment, to move constantly, to react to novel stimuli, to seek immediate rewards, that classroom isn't a learning environment. It's an environment specifically designed to make them fail. And then we diagnose them with a disorder. None of this means ADHD doesn't cause real challenges in the modern world. It does. The struggles are real. The frustrations are real. The difficulty with executive function, time management, emotional regulation, sustained attention on low stimulation tasks, those are genuine experiences that affect millions of lives in profound ways. But understanding the evolutionary origins of those traits changes the frame. It shifts the question from, what's wrong with this brain, to, what kind of world was this brain built for? And the answer is, a world of movement, novelty, immediate reward, physical challenge, constant environmental change, and high-stakes decision-making. A world that hasn't existed for most humans in 10,000 years. There's one more piece of this puzzle that deserves attention, and it's the most counterintuitive: the emotional intensity that comes with ADHD. People with ADHD tend to experience emotions more intensely than neurotypical individuals. Joy is bigger, frustration is sharper, boredom is physically painful, connection is deeper. That emotional intensity, which in the modern world can feel overwhelming and destabilizing, would have been a powerful asset in a social species that depended on tight group bonds for survival. The member of the group who felt things the most deeply was also the member who was most attuned to the emotions of others, most invested in the welfare of the group, most motivated to act when something was wrong. Emotional intensity drives empathy. It drives loyalty. It drives the willingness to take risks for people you care about. In a survival context, that's not a liability. That's the glue that holds the group together. So here's where we land. For most of human history, the traits we now call ADHD were not a disorder. They were a survival strategy, refined over tens of thousands of years by natural selection, coded into our DNA by a gene that appeared at exactly the moment our species began its greatest journey. The restlessness that can't be quieted was once the drive that crossed continents. The impulsivity that gets you in trouble was once the reflex that saved your life. The distractibility that costs you at work was once the vigilance that spotted the predator before anyone else. The hyperfocus that makes you lose track of time was once the intensity that tracked prey for days without losing the trail. The emotional depth that overwhelms you was once the bond that held your people together in the dark. You're not broken. You're running ancient software in a modern world, and the world is the thing that changed, not you. The next time someone tells you that ADHD ADHD is a deficit, remember this: the gene behind it was selected for. Evolution chose it. It spread through human populations not because it was a mistake, but because the people who carried it were the ones who survived. They were the explorers, the risk takers, the ones who walked into the unknown and came back with something the group needed. 50,000 years ago, they led us across continents. They found the food. They spotted the danger. They moved when everyone else froze. They weren't disordered, they were essential. And somewhere inside every person living with ADHD today, that ancient wiring is still there, still scanning the horizon, still restless, still looking for the next ridge, the next challenge, the next discovery. Not because something went wrong, but because for most of the time humans have existed on this planet, that's exactly what going right looked like. If this video changed the way you think about ADHD, or about the strange, brilliant, ancient wiring inside your own brain, leave a like. Subscribe if you want more stories about the hidden science behind what makes us human. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's spent their whole life being told their brain is broken, when the truth is, their brain was built for a world most of us have forgotten.